Hi, Acton.
Hi, George.
Welcome to Orders of Magnitude, formerly known as Red Femmes, with your hosts, Acton. Say hi, Acton.
Hi, everybody.
And myself, George. This is a podcast for people who want to do their homework. Acton and I read books together, and then we talk about them. And sometimes
things get personal.
The homework for today was to read Disembodying Women, Perspectives on Pregnancy and the Unborn by Barbara Duden. Of course, due to international shipping restrictions, since I am in Austria, the only person to complete the homework was Acton, although she did give me like a 40-page document, so I feel like I've had the experience in part.
You read about half of it, yes.
Before we dig in, as always, let's start with first things first.
So the question for today is, what experiences have you had with seeing fetal ultrasound images? Or perhaps more generally, like your experiences with seeing any kind of pictures of the unborn, billboards, books, ads, etc.
So I've seen all the billboards and the ads and stuff, but I'm going to take this in a political direction because I think it's clarifying about the nature of paradigms in general, which is going to inform our conversation today. So a paradigm is not a viewpoint, right? A paradigm is broader than a viewpoint, includes all the viewpoints. So it's about the context in which varying views are asserted. You might be aware, Acton, that in nearly all cases in which a woman gets an early elective abortion, she gets an ultrasound. This sounds logical, right? Well, after reading your lengthy and nicely curated excerpts of this book, I realized that what I assumed was just logical, makes sense to confirm a pregnancy before terminating one, you could argue, is actually the product of this modern fetal paradigm. And this paradigm of the developmental notion of pregnancy, conception, implantation, growth, birth, encompasses all of us moderns, regardless of whether we think elective termination is moral or should be legal. All sexually active women, whether in hope or in dread, believe that pregnancy, and thus our medicalized response to it, starts with a missed period and leads to a test, which leads to a declaration, I'm pregnant. We believe in the modern techniques that tell us something about ourselves that we cannot feel. We believe that tools like the vaginal ultrasound show us something true, though we cannot see it with our own unaided eyes. In some states, vaginal ultrasound is required by law for women seeking elective termination. The goal here for the pro-life legislatures that mandate this procedure is to provoke an emotional response that might be organically missing. See, this is your baby is the idea. It is as if they are aware that without such tools, women might not conceptualize, pun unavoidable, something that they can neither see nor feel as a baby. As if they secretly know that there is a meaningful difference between the entity at the beginning of the developmental process and the end. Anti-abortion advocates do not want women to act on that difference. Yet even so, we moderns are, all of us, in agreement that this thing called pregnancy begins before that difference is organically perceived. And I have to say, in a world where abortion remains legal based on the number of weeks since a woman's last period, the idea, which Duden explores in this book, that a sexually active woman generations ago would not have understood herself to be pregnant when she missed a period seems downright crazy. It's not just that we have tests. Those are still pretty new in the long view. They basically came out the year I was born, in fact. It's that we have this developmental paradigm, and part of this paradigm is the notion of assistance and control over development. We now basically take it for granted that a pregnancy will result in a child. And this expectation leads all of us, whether in hope or dread, to the medical provider. We don't wait alone for time to tell us what this or that bodily sign might mean. We know. We can no more imagine taking an easily procured herbal concoction to restore our stuck menses than we can imagine waiting until we feel an internal kick to announce that we are going to have a baby. Both those things exist in a paradigm we no longer have. Right. And I don't think this paradigm of it's a baby from the beginning has come with many upsides for women. I mean, of course, the medical care in relationship to pregnancy and labor have saved lots of lives. I'm not disputing that. But the paradigm of it's a baby from the beginning leads to a total revolution in the way that the early pregnancy has been understood. It leads to miscarriage being understood as a lost life, a child, rather than a natural and neutral event. It leads to the demand for increasingly expensive and invasive medical procedures to save extremely premature babies. In short, it creates material expectations where there should only be, and where in the pre-modern era there only were or was hope. So, and it was a private and radically contingent hope. Private because only the mother was privy to what was happening in her body, and radically contingent because while a woman could attempt to terminate an early pregnancy to restore her menses, she could do very little to control the fetus's healthy development. Indeed, you can't really even say that. Development is our paradigm. So you might want to say she could do little to determine what the fruit of her womb would be, child or not. Mm-hmm. This is why quickening is so crucial. That was the sign of aliveness. It's stunning, really, to think about how intimate women were with uncertainty before the modern age. I think it was probably much easier because of such uncertainties, and not just about pregnancy, but about all sorts of accidents and illnesses, to nurture a kind of religious faith, faith in what you can't see. Perhaps it's easier to hope when hope is all you have to work with.
Yeah. That is fascinating, like our universal beholdenness to that developmental paradigm, which fundamentally cuts us off from the experience of women from earlier centuries. Like we can't unsee or unknow what our technology shows us. I don't know that it's possible to get out of the paradigm like this once your culture is in it. I'm trying to remember back to my first experiences of like seeing inside a pregnancy. If my mother had ultrasounds done of her pregnancy with my little brother, who was born in 86, I don't have any memory of that. Not in person and not like as a photo printout. She didn't like put a picture on the fridge, of him. I remember seeing a transparent womb diagram in the first book about sex that my mom gave me to read. And in it, the woman was like fully clothed and her husband and the other kids were standing next to her, and you could just see inside her belly. And it was very near the end of the pregnancy. So the fetus was fully developed and it looked just like a newborn all curled up, So the image definitely conveyed this is a baby and the baby is an addition to this nice family. On another page, there was the developmental spread, the picture of like the sperm and the egg. And I'm pretty sure they had like smiley faces and googly eyes on them.
Wow.
Like, everything was personified, even the gametes, right?
That's funny.
And then, yeah.
I should have had half a smile each.
Oh, yeah, Sorry. It didn't. No, they each had their own little face.
I know, but you realize that's
Isn't that weird? I never thought about that till this moment. I was like, oh yeah, it's
like that movie, right? You probably never saw that, but it was like this opening scene is like this sort of a race of the sperm towards the egg, and it's like narrated.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll find it on YouTube for the show notes.
Yeah, that'd be funny to see. So the googly-eyed gametes, and then there was a little embryo, and then in each shot, the baby was like getting bigger and bigger in each new kind of womb frame that you would see on the page. And those images conveyed continuity and personality all the way through. And I had positive feelings about seeing that as a young girl. Like it fit the model of the family, of my family. And it conveyed that pregnancy is the result of a couple's mutual love. And it's also about family formation. And that's how you got here. It's how you got to be you. So it conveyed a sense of personal identification with the embryo and the fetus, right? It's like looking at a little self-history is how it's presented. Then, so that's like the sweet memory. Here's the memory. So in 8th grade, back when I was a fairly outspoken little pro-life punk evangelist in my public school, somehow I gotten a hold of a pro-life book that was probably made in the 70s or 80s. And it had color photographs of bloody aborted babies in a huge black trash bag.
Wow.
Ostensibly from an abortion clinic. Yeah. And it was extremely disturbing.
I would say so.
Like, the images were clearly from the latter half of pregnancy because they looked just like innocent little babies. Right. They looked very formed. And I felt horrified and morally disgusted by the images, which was obviously the point of them being displayed in the book. Right. And I remember bringing this book to school and showing the pictures to some other kids who came from secular liberal families. I don't remember their reaction, but I can see myself, the classroom that I was in, holding the book. I definitely have a perspectival memory moment of sharing that. But the images were very effective at eliciting moral horror in me. And I'm sure that shaped my pro-life views as I was growing up. That picture's worth 1,000 words, right? Fast forward to when I started experiencing my own pregnancies, I had ultrasounds at 20 weeks for each of them. And I remember them as being really joyful occasions. My husband was always in the room with me. With the first pregnancy, we decided to find out the sex. And that was fun, having the ultrasound tech, describe the different body parts, and point out where the penis wasn't, which meant that it was a girl. And for my second child, we opted not to find out the sex. And then that was also fun to choose not to know and then to wait for the surprise. It's a boy, you know. And then during the ultrasound for my third pregnancy, I remember watching the ultrasound tech get serious and go quiet, which every woman knows is a bad sign. Like you get that sinking feeling. And she asked, have you had an ultrasound for this pregnancy yet? Or is this your first one? And it was our first one because we'd opted out of the earlier ones because they had been framed to me as basically looking for abnormalities that would offer me the chance to abort. And I knew I wasn't going to do that. And so I just skipped them because they're like, well, it's not going to help me decide anything. Why do I need to look? You know? So it's another example of me choosing not to know. So I told her, no, this is our first one. Is something wrong? And she said, well, I'm seeing 2 heads in there. And it took me a minute to register that she meant twins and not like some horrifying deformity. But she herself was a twin. And then she started talking about how lovely it was being a twin, and twins are great. And then the doctor came in and he looked too, and everything was fine, and the babies were healthy, and they're pointing out the 2 little penises.
So are your twins identical?
Probably. We actually, not to know, we didn't do the test.
Okay.
Like they gave us I don't know, some kind of material from the birth. Like you can send these to a lab and get tested and find out for sure. And it's like, I don't know, they're in my underwear drawer somewhere. I never, because they look exactly alike. I think they are because, fraternal twins are inherited. Like that's kind of passed on in the family. But
because it's
like a dropping 2 eggs phenomenon, and like women's bodies that's that's heritable. But we don't have any twins as far as we know on either side of our family, and so identical twins are the lightning strike.
The early splitting is spontaneous and not necessarily it has no genetic.
Correct. Yeah. And so it was like the lightning strike or the lottery. And so most likely that's what it is. But we just laughed, when we found out. We were like, okay, guess it's time to get a minivan. We have to bump it up, And can you imagine being a woman who had twins like back before ultrasounds? Like before, like you just showed up at the birth starts happening, and then a second baby comes out. The doctor and the tech were sort of like feeling for me. They're like, wow, usually women who have twins, they find out a lot earlier than 20 weeks. Like they were like trying to like support me as if it was like, oh, you're only finding out now.
Did you not know? Did you not have any idea?
No, I had no idea. But
I mean, 20 weeks is pretty early in terms of like internal sensation though.
I can't remember if I had started to feel kicking yet at that point. I just can't recall. Early on, the midwife had done like the fetal Doppler thing. She was listening for heartbeats. And in the chart, she wrote 2 heartbeats, twins, question mark.
Oh, and she didn't tell you.
She thought she didn't tell me because I didn't want the early ultrasound.
Right.
And she wasn't going to like say maybe. And then see, it's all about the early knowledge. She didn't want to say and then maybe make me think possibly it was twins when it wasn't. And then what I feel like I had like lost a child, you know what I mean? So she just waited, and she didn't tell me because I didn't really want to know more. And that's why I found out late, but it worked out fine.
Yeah. I mean, what are you, the last woman in history to do a vaginal twins birth?
I might have been.
I think so.
That's possible. Right. I expect a lot of mothers of twins died in childbirth, back in the day, because it's twice the complications. I mean, it can get so one birth is already complicated, but so I feel really lucky that, my boys and I were safe. I did get to deliver them naturally, vaginally, which is very rare these days. Typically they just schedule for a C-section.
Right.
But my OB was kind of one of the old guard. He'd been doing this for ages, and he was in his 70s. He knew what to do. He knew how to help me. I still had to deliver in the operating room.
They wanted to be prepared. I see.
Yeah. And I don't know, there were dozens of people in the room waiting to fly in and do all
strangers.
The things. Yeah. But it's like when you're like deep in birth, you're totally naked. You don't see it. You just don't register it. There's no shame. You're so animal at that point, So I kind of noted, I looked up afterwards and I was like, oh, there's a lot of people in here. They had quite a show. I think I got the sense that like everyone was rooting for me. There may have even been clapping.
Well, I'm sure. I bet you most people in that room had never seen it.
Probably. Yeah. So I gave them quite a day. I gave them a story to tell. Yeah,
no, that's astonishing because you think now about the reason that C-sections are scheduled isn't just for the protection of the baby or the mother. It's the liability for the doctor. I mean, let's be honest.
Right. Yeah. So I feel very grateful I got to kind of retain my hopes and my autonomy in that moment. But back to the images, like I got photo printouts of my ultrasounds. I put them on the fridge, and seeing my kids through that medium, seeing them as my kids in those grainy black and white images, that felt entirely lovely and happy to me. It felt very normal. That's what everyone was
Well,
doing.
it had been normalized. I mean,
it had been normalized, yeah. And I don't think I posted them on social media, but that's the thing people do now. It's on, they post it on Facebook.
Your kids were born after social media? Wow, okay. I have to remind myself you're a youngin'.
I was pregnant with my first child when I got on Facebook for the first time. Right.
Oh,
and I was
gracious.
part of that initial wave of people who started to like post pictures of their kids. And then I don't know, just a couple months into that, my husband was like, oh, we are pulling the plug on this thing. We are scraping Facebook of all child pictures.
You are married to a wise man.
Yeah. And so we fixed that real early. And now as far as it's in our power, we have no pictures of children on social media at all. So I'm very grateful for him. But yeah, so it's been a very interesting journey following Barbara Duden's line of argument in the book and learning to see my experience as actually extremely novel and bizarre, historically speaking. I thought I was normal and I felt very happy being normal, but I'm actually weird.
We're all weird, yeah.
Rethink. We're all weird. So.
Okay, so summarize this book for us.
Disembodying Women was written in 1993, and it is just as applicable now as it was when it first came out. Duden was a historian of the body, which I didn't even know that existed. That sounds cool.
Doesn't it?
And she was a friend of our favorite Catholic priest and philosopher, Ivan Illich. And it's through the footnotes in his book, Gender, that we discovered her work. Though Duden and Illich were collaborators in the project of calling into question contemporary certainties. Why do we assume certain perspectives and practices in modern culture are, obviously true? Like, what policies and programs do these certainties serve and justify? Duden in particular investigates the certainties that we have around pregnancy. So here's how the book jacket introduces her project. In earlier times, a woman knew she was pregnant when she experienced quickening. She felt movement within her. Today, a woman relies on what she sees in a test result or a digital sonogram image to confirm her pregnancy. A private experience, once mediated by women themselves, has become a public experience interpreted and controlled by medical professionals. Barbara Duden takes a closer look at this contemporary transformation of women's experience of pregnancy. She suggests that advances in technology and parallel changes in public discourse have reframed pregnancy as a managed process, the mother as an ecosystem, and the fetus as an endangered species. New ways of seeing the body produce new ways of experiencing the body. Because technology allows us to penetrate that once secret enclosure of the womb, the image of the fetus, exposed to public gaze, has eclipsed that of the woman in the public mind. And Duden describes her goal for the book in the introduction. She says, I limit myself to one task, to show historically that the human fetus, as conceptualized today, is not a creature of God or a natural fact, but an engineered construct of modern society. I shall discuss the many-layered process involved in the synthesis of this fetus, the invention of fetal norms and needs, and the pseudo-scientific directives that ascribe the responsibility for the management of a life, as defined for optimal measurement and supervision, to women.
So, since you read the whole book, do you want to share just some reactions to what it felt like to read it?
Yeah, so for me, reading Duden felt quite a bit like reading Illich. Like, they're both very incisive, insightful, surprising. They both dig into history and reveal how differently we perceive and think and feel today compared to people in the past. I had multiple moments reading the book. I think you did too, because we kind of dialogued in the comments, the Google document.
It is a sort of Illich kind of feeling where you're just in a few sentences, you're suddenly looking at something you've always taken as obvious. Mm-hmm. It's suddenly brought into relief as totally not obvious and totally new.
Yes. And I love that. It's very unsettling, but I love that feeling of like, I am stumbling onto something brand new here. This will give me the chance to reframe everything. For my 3 pregnancies, I had natural childbirth, like without medications, including for the twins. So I had this view of myself as like an all natural, crunchy granola, old school birthing woman, but I relied on pregnancy tests and ultrasounds just like everyone else around me did. And it never occurred to me until reading this book that my entire experience of pregnancy, my view of myself, my view of the growing little ones inside me could be so thoroughly shaped by those technologies. So the book humbled me. It made me realize I'm a lot more modern and a lot less natural than I thought I was. And it convinced me that perception isn't this sort of passive thing. It's an action in its own right. And there is interpretation baked into perception. So if our perceptions are technologically enhanced or extended, our interpretations of what we are seeing automatically change. And it can change without us realizing it. So technology can change meaning, and that implies that there's a hidden moral element baked into the use of it, as well as into the eschewal of it. So, I mean, hats off to Barbara for poking me in my certainties, because she sure did.
She's doing for pregnancy what I found that in the first few sentences of Gender Illich was doing for feminism.
Yes.
Sort of, take the balloon and here, pin, meet balloon. Pop.
All right. Why don't you read our first quote?
So one of the terms that, or ways of describing this change from the invention of the fetus, it's about vision, and she calls it losing the horizon. This is a quote from the early pages of the book. Among the invisible, the unborn, which is invisible in the body of a woman, is an important historical subject. Two things distinguish it from others of its kind. It is never there with certainty. In spite of many signs and intimations of its presence, one can never be sure about it. Unlike the dead, one's guardian angel, or God, it cannot be grasped by faith. It remains a hope. And second, before a child comes to light, it is a non-doom, a not yet. Non-doom is Latin, I'm assuming. It has a peculiar temporal dimension. It is the only one of the invisible beings that knocks at the door of existence and emerges as an infant. It has become very difficult for us today to realize, to sense, the horizon beyond which the not yet was hidden for most of historical time. One of the most fundamental but least noted events in the second half of the 20th century is the loss of horizon. It was just yesterday that the whole Earth suddenly appeared as the blue planet, and we began to accept the fact that all would be exposed to recording equipment orbiting far above this Tower of Babel. I regard the fetus as one of the modern results of living without a horizon. The unborn is closely tied to the history of hope. But when hope is dissolved into expectations that can be managed at will, scientifically, sociologically, and arbitrarily, the unborn is no more. I really do hope we'll spend more time here on the podcast on Orders of Magnitude talking about how we engage with the past. What does it mean to spend a lot of time learning about and thinking about places and paradigms that are only accessible to us as history? That quote, but when hope is dissolved into expectations that can be managed at will, scientifically, sociologically, and arbitrarily, the unborn is no more. This is so powerful a statement of the fact that we can know about what was, but we cannot use that knowledge to undo these changes. The horizon Duden describes here is gone forever, for all intents and purposes. So if this knowledge is not actionable in a broad cultural sense, what can it lead us to on a personal level? I think you're really onto something when you talk about feeling humbled by reading her book. I think being surprised and suddenly being taken out of our own givens, such that we realize they aren't obvious, is an instructive and valuable experience. I think that when we encounter the unfamiliar, we're more likely to think deeply about something. I think perhaps the only way to restore a kind of personal horizon in this sort of partial way is to read older books, or read books about older things, right? And older could mean 20, 200, 2,000 years old. Books, actually, one of the things I've been experiencing as I read a lot this summer is books really do show their age quickly. And I think that's a good thing. So this replacement of hope by expectations that we feel we can and must manage, it's not just true in an existential sense of procreation, but I feel like it's also true in a philosophical sense about how we look at the world. And I think political polarization reflects this. It reflects the kind of sureness that everyone has about the world, what it is, what it needs. And of course, that right away, once you're sure, you can declare who's on the right side of history and who isn't, right? We're drowning in data now. It's even got its own science.
Right.
Social media is all sureness, all confidence. Like, it's all sort of declarative, right? It's books, I think they ask more of us. To read means to be willing to weigh an author's ideas with more calm and genuine consideration. Perhaps that calm comes from and instills a sense of the horizon. A new book, as in one you have yet to read, is a wonderful combination of a not yet and an already been. Because it's obviously already been fixed between its covers, but it's also a kind of non-doom, a not yet, right? It's made alive by your encounter with it. You can't get a sonogram of a book. I mean, I guess isn't that the irony though, right? Of Cliff Notes, of readers' guides.
I don't want to wait. Like I agree with you. There's no actual going back in time and like replacing the veil of female skin over pregnancy, restoring the horizon that keeps us hopeful and humble. That ship has sailed for pregnancy, for better and for worse. But like you're saying, that doesn't mean we have to adopt a universal horizon-busting Tower of Babel attitude to everything. And finding ways to sit humbly in not knowing and not yet, like coming to terms with non-doom instead of grasping for management and control at every chance we get, that can help protect us from the moral hazard of hubris. And I love your image of the book as a non-doom. It's like a seed, right? Like it's dormant, but it's potent, and it's waiting for the soil of your mind and your heart. And then whatever grows out of that encounter is not really knowable in advance. So it's very, very pregnant imagery. And just occurred to me when you were talking about expectations, we use the term expecting. Oh, are you expecting? What to expect when you're expecting, rather than, are you hoping? Right?
Yes.
So we definitely conceded the term.
And all of this may have started with the curiosity of men, but women are totally, like you were saying of your own experiences, it's not something that is just, it's not one person's opinion or one person's viewpoint. It's the paradigm we're all in. Men, women,
yes,
doulas, yep. All of us are in it.
And I love Dudin's poetic words. The unborn is the only one of the invisible beings that knocks at the door of existence and emerges as an infant. And I love that she classes the unborn, in a sense, with the dead, with angels, and with God, rather than with us as visible persons, as citizens.
I think that's really the whole thing in a nutshell, is that we don't have those, we don't take those other non-dooms.
We don't believe in them anymore.
I guess the way would be to put it is, those invisible entities no longer have status. And so so we've moved Correct. The unborn into the status of a person.
I see that as evidence of materialism. Women in the past, the way they experienced pregnancy, like they didn't see and personify and attach to their baby in the womb the way that we do now. And that doesn't make them callous or not maternal or unloving. But their experience was different from ours because technological advances have changed our perspective. We are weird. We are different, not them. And the whole medical management paradigm is so new, and it's frankly anxiety inducing. Like I recently read a book called I'm Sorry for My Loss, all about the whole variety of pregnancy loss, from abortion to miscarriage to stillbirth.
Sounds depressing.
All the things. Actually, it wasn't. It was actually really helpful to me because I've never lost a pregnancy before. And so there was just a lot I didn't know. So they delve into the history at the same time as they're showing how women today experience things so differently. Because the authors have both had multiple miscarriages and very complicated pregnancies, and one had an abortion. And so they were sort of dealing with these things. They talked to a lot of women about their experiences. It was a really great book. They make the case, even as women who deeply mourned and were kind of destroyed by their own miscarriages, they're saying women, prior to the modern era, just didn't mourn miscarriages the way that we do. Particularly with early pregnancies, they just did not experience it like the death of a child. If it was registered as a pregnancy at all, and again, a lot of women wouldn't have even known that they were pregnant to be able to know that they were miscarrying, right? If they did realize it, there was very much a sort of a move on, try again kind of a experience. They might have been disappointed, they might have been relieved, but they weren't crushed. Like as long as they had other children. Married women were basically trying to avoid pregnancy all the time. But of course, without reliable family planning methods, they were usually pregnant much more often than they'd prefer. And they would love any child that was born to them, but they'd most likely feel relieved by a miscarriage. And they wouldn't see these feelings as contradictory.
Yeah, wow.
Isn't that fascinating? They expected to grow their family, which they did indeed desire. They wanted a family, through unwanted pregnancies they had tried to avoid and which they were ambivalent about until birth. And then they attached after birth. And they deeply mourned babies and children who died. Like that is so much more ambiguous and complex than like a pro-life, pro-choice, planned, unplanned, wanted, unwanted.
It's a completely different paradigm. Yeah.
Completely different. Right. To be like, I tried desperately to avoid this pregnancy and I was kind of trying not to think about it. And I would have been totally fine if it miscarried, but now the baby's here and I love the baby. And then 3 months later, the baby dies and I'm
Mm-hmm.
crushed.
Mm-hmm.
Like all the feelings. They would have had
Like
all
they
the feelings.
experienced that multiple times in your
Yeah.
life.
Yeah. Right. So it's just so different. We have so much more control. So we plan our pregnancies so much. That's another thing that book talked about. It's like the degree to which through contraception and through fertility technologies that we plan and control when we get pregnant means that the weight of that pregnancy is so hyper loaded in a way that back when women didn't have control over it, pregnancies came and went. It just kind of happened. Life happened through you,
Right.
and you just did not have the reins. But when you have the reins, ooh, things matter so much more.
If you're married at a young age, you're gonna have sex, and part of it is the duration over which this, but of course, if you start at 38, the stakes, right? You have to have that feeling of control because you've been making all your decisions up till then based on this promise that you're going to have control.
Yep. Yeah. Their childbearing years were just so much longer. Yeah. The image that came to mind as I was reading that book was getting pregnant and avoiding pregnancy is like a game of dodgeball, right? Like if you want to play dodgeball, you're going into a game where you're going to get hit by a ball. But what's the whole point of playing dodgeball? You try to not get hit. So like if you got married, you knew you were going to get pregnant, but you're spending your whole marriage trying to not get pregnant. But when you get pregnant, like I got hit by a ball. Okay. It's part of the game. Right. You get back up and then you try not to get hit again. So it's like you're willingly entering in as you're always trying to avoid, and then you accept what happens, So it's a different frame. So the veil of these women's own skin minimizes the depth of their sufferings. Right. But now with pregnancy tests and early ultrasounds, a woman can begin to feel as if she's already given birth when she's only a few weeks along. I think that's part of what Duden means by the unborn is no more.
I think that's an excellent interpretation.
It's like birth comes at 3 weeks with the pregnancy test, right?
I'm pregnant means I have a child. Oh boy.
Yes.
And that's true no matter whether you choose termination or not. Because why would the stakes be so high if everyone didn't agree on that? Like we're all reacting to the same.
We all do agree. Yeah, our technology lets us manage and monitor pregnancy as if it were a born baby. We begin treating the unborn like the born once we can see them. And that's the invention of the fetus. The unborn that we see and manage as if it were born. Like pushing that baby out into the world now means less because we have technologically and medically pushed our way inside. Like you can see this too in the phenomenon of gender reveal parties, right? Which happened before the birth, which is kind of like having the wedding reception before the wedding. Like so something disordered about it, but the timing is scrambled by the tech. So, and pro-choice, pro-life, we're all in that scramble together.
Yeah. Yeah. The title of this section is The Seen and the Shown. In this quote, Duden is referring to 2 different issues of the magazine Life. We have to specify that it's a magazine because, if we have any younger listeners, they won't remember it because it hasn't been in print, I don't think, for a decade now. Yeah, wow. Does it even exist at all? I don't think it ever did an online version. Anyway,
I don't know.
One from 1965 and one from 1990, both of which had photographs by Lennart Nilsson in them. The 1965 issue showed dead fetuses in jars, which were cleverly posed and billed as living fetuses in the womb, and who looked very much like astronauts floating in space. While the 1990 edition of Life contained images of a blastocyst at 2, 4, and 8 days after fertilization. These later images were created as a collage of digital measurements by an electron microscope. So, referring to the effects of these images on us, Duden writes, we are told what to see. We are told that these clouds and masses, that's the blastocyst images, were recorded by a scanning ultramicroscope and that they represent a human being. Our readiness to see on command has grown tremendously in the intervening 25 years. This popular exhibition of fetoscopy, that is, imagery of the fetus, spoke powerfully about the desire to dissolve the frontier between the viewer's eye and the unborn. It effected the breakdown of a horizon which, since the beginning of history, had made the unborn an unseen and unverifiable presence. Photoscopy solicited the viewer to join in an immodest adventure like a peeping Tom. The Life magazine of 1965 panders to the libido videndi, the ravenous urge to extend one's sight, to see more, to see things larger or smaller than the eye can grasp, to see things which have previously been off limits. We have gotten used to being shown no matter what, within or beyond the limited range of human sight. This habituation to the monopoly of visualization on command strongly suggests that only those things that can in some way be visualized, recorded, and replayed at will are part of reality. The result is a strange mistrust of our own eyes, a disposition to take as real only that which is mechanically displayed in a photograph, a statistical curve, or a table. Losing a real horizon, we have lost the sense of obscurity. Through immodest revelations, for example, the skinning of a woman's body, we have lost the power to discriminate between the seen and the shown. We have gotten used to a world of confused figments where, for a churchman, a vague clump is a persuasive argument for a life made in the image and likeness of God. The great potter's clay has been turned into a montage programmed by a genetic code. She's got her finger on why this is so problematic. Maybe it's time for a new kind of visual chastity. Maybe we're coming back to a new understanding of why choosing not to see might be good. So if we're used to being shown no matter what, but what happens when that voraciousness has been not just politicized, but also monetized and then, artificialized, right? More and more of what we're going to be shown is going to be auto-generated. It's going to be it's going to be sort of show me this on demand with AI, right? I think these things probably go together. The lack of differentiation. I can't even say that word. I can type it, but I can't say it. The lack of differentiation between the seen. So like what our common as in shared sense of human eyesight tells us, and the shown, like these images generated by machines and effects that say, here, see this, right? This is what you're seeing. If we don't differentiate, maybe that encourages our veracity for ever more images. But then we have to ask ourselves why. Mm-hmm. There were narratives in place of what we formerly couldn't see and didn't try to see, right? And what if those worked better? Now these narratives are strained by attempting to keep them when we filled the former blanks of the scene with the, quote, truth of what is shown. So this is where you get these sites of confusion, like what Duden is alluding to here, right? When she says, the narrative that an infant is, made in the image and likeness of God, if you try to impute that to the images of these embryos and these zygotes and the blastocytes, you end up sort of reducing it. Like suddenly there's a conflict where there wasn't a conflict.
I love what you said about the need for visual chastity as the counterpoint to what Duden calls our libido videndi, that ravenous appetite to see more. Like, I can't think of a better phrase to capture what we're succumbing to when we doom scroll on our phones, when we surf the internet. It's interesting to me that, to place this very obvious sense of disordered libido videndi, which all of us give into with our smartphones, side by side with what Duden is criticizing in her book, a medicalized, technologically fueled voyeurism of pregnancy. And the urge to see without limits, that can take the form of an endless desire for novelty, like with TikTok, or it can take the form of the urge to manage and control. And I think our culture, with its love of science and its entrepreneurial spirit and its fear of death, has kind of given us a pass on all things pertaining to medical research. Like, if it could potentially help someone, then let's do it, trade-offs be damned. And I think sometimes we deceive ourselves when we say that we just want to know or we just want to understand. When the truth is we actually want to control. And so Duden uses very evocative language to show the shadow side of innovations that turn the narrative-saturated unseen into the technologically mediated shown. So she uses words like flaying women, skinning women, the immodest peeping Tom, comparing sonograms to pornography. And the people who would object to having a woman's genitals displayed in a magazine apparently have no objection to having what's still behind a woman's genitals and was created by the use of her genitals displayed in a magazine. And Illich picks up on this thread when he talks about the shameless violence done to women by turning the inner mysteries of their bodies into a showcase for this libido vivendi and for the sake of pro-life politics. Duden convinced me that there is something inherently prurient about the visual display of the fetus, prurient and often emotionally manipulative. Like the YouTube algorithm serves me videos by the pro-life activist group Live Action. And one of their shticks is that they go on college campuses and they find liberal young women and they show them animated videos of surgical abortions for the express purpose of making them feel physically sick and morally disgusted. And that's a prime example of like the shown rather than the seen, right?
Yes. Imagine one of those liberal women saying, that's pornography. It's a very provocative statement to like that comparison. You see the politics of that.
The thing is, if we just use our eyes, what we can see is a woman.
Eventually.
Right? It takes a little while, right? But you just see a woman, and then eventually you see, oh, she's got a baby bump, a pregnant woman, right? So she remains central. When we're just using our eyes, she's central, she's unavoidable. To have any access to the unborn, you must address her. You must respect her. You must go through her. You must help her, right? She's the gatekeeper of the pregnancy. Our unaided eyes naturally communicate this reality to us, and that's why people of the past acted according to that reality and saw the process of pregnancy as proper to the world of women, so that the woman herself represents a horizon which man, individually and collectively as the state, cannot and should not transgress, right? Their eyes told them this truth. But the modern tools, which make the inner contents of a woman visible to the wider world, do so at the cost of making her invisible and at the cost of moving pregnancy from the world of women to the sphere of medical doctors and public health and state management and law, right? So she must be visually eclipsed for the modern fetus to be created in images and in the mind of the public. And it's the turning of something inherently private into a public display that smells like exploitation and pornography. And of course, the irony is that, religious conservatives who are against the display of sexual images are more than happy to create and utilize fetal images, which likewise diminish women in the public eye. And so I personally want to see abortion become less frequent, and I want to support pro-natalist and pro-family growth policies, but I do not support the emotionally manipulative use of fetal imagery in the pro-life cause. Like Duden has convinced me that that is an unethical approach to achieving pro-natal goals. And prior to reading her book, that never would have occurred to me. I would have had no framework for understanding why that's a problem. I would have thought, well, the baby is in there. We're just looking at it. It's just taking a picture. Like we're just showing what's actually there. I had no sense that what was happening was a creation rather than a revelation. And so lastly, I just want to highlight Duden's language about visualization on command, like our readiness to see on command and believe everything we're shown, and how she connects that to a mistrust of our own eyes. And that phrase really jumped out at me for the way it connects us to the trans issue, which we talk a lot about on the show, and the relentless demands of trans activists to insist that we mistrust our own eyes and that, what we can obviously see about another person, which is their sex, and instead take their word for it. I'm a man, I'm a woman, I'm non-binary, and believe what they are showing us, their medically managed gender expression, because they too are using technology to turn the seen, biological sex, into the shown, the gender they identify with. And everything about our culture is grooming us to receive and believe images we are shown over and above our own physical senses.
Wow. Yeah.
So
it's so interesting because it's all tied up with identity as a way of, marketed reality as opposed to sort of just received common sense reality. And the constant plea, right. Like the plea of like, it's a baby from the beginning, or you can't tell me who I am, or only, what's the other one? Children know who they are.
Yes.
It's that,
right.
that
Children know
is that knowledge
right.
we're confused about where knowledge comes from. We're very confused.
We are very confused. Yeah.
And it's funny reading these older accounts that sound almost unbelievable. Like our first instinct, we're about to read one here in the next section.
Yeah.
We think they were confused, right? Because we really think that if we can see the development, of the stages of pregnancy, we really believe that signifies something. We have attached a narrative of person to that we actually believe is real. And when we read about how it was perceived before all those things were known, we think they were just acting in ignorance. It's really hard to understand that they're both knowledge. They're just different
Yes.
They're just knowledges premised on different assumptions.
Yes. Can I read this one? I love it. Okay. So this section is called The Tailor's Wife. The body historian wants to know what it felt like to be alive 250 years ago, but only slowly does she come to hear how women spoke about their embodiment back in the time of powdered wigs. What I read is so strange that I must struggle against disbelief before I am able to take these women at their word. And then she goes on to describe the experience of the tailor's wife in a small town in Germany in 1724. And this woman is visiting her local doctor, Dr. Storch. The woman complains that since Christmas, her monthlies have been stuck, and that at a certain point, she imagined herself pregnant. We must not forget that 7 generations ago, pregnancy was much more common than it is today. On any given day of the year, a significant number of all women between 17 and 40 in this part of Thuringia imagined themselves pregnant. The symptoms of pregnancy on which modern women base their belief are different from those of Storch's patients. Blood is neither an argument against pregnancy nor a reason to be particularly upset. Yesterday, however, the flow increased so much that she swooned, and today she noticed that something leathery also left her with the blood, whose flow did not decrease. Today, when the menses stop for 4 months, most women would know if they are pregnant or not. What the tailor's wife describes appears to us like the story of an abortion, and we would look for a fetus in the discharge. We would worry that this poor woman might be suffering shock. She calls the thing which left her something leathery, something made of skins. I have collected the words women use when they talk about this. They speak of blood curds, wrong growths, burnt out stuff, and singed blood. As an aside, the woman continues to have labor pains. Dr. Storch prescribes a drug for accelerating birth, and the next day she delivers something that looks like afterbirth. I cannot categorize this event by our standards. I do not know if this was a spontaneous abortion or the result of several weeks' effort on the part of the woman's mother to loosen the menstrual congestion of her daughter, or if the woman herself had used one of the strong abortifacient potions that every woman would know. Storch places her in the same category as the many other women who occasionally bring forth not children, but other kinds of fruits. In Storch's view, the physician, like the gardener, lends his support to nature, and nature, in Storch's sensorium, is very active. Storch sees nature at work in the womb, expelling what is untoward, rather than aborting what should have become. The whole process of generation in Storch's writings is ambiguous. It can go wrong from the very beginning. According to our witness, conception, from carnal mingling to the moment of birth, is Janus-faced. It could be true and real and lead to the timely appearance of a child, or wasted, empty, and useless, a fulsome germen that nature must purge. And from the doctor's point of view, whatever it might be, it is a not yet. It is of uncertain issue. It makes no sense to interpret this luxuriant growth of untimely fruits that issues from an organ in need of constant purging, with categories now current in bioethics or feminist or political discourse.
That's just wild, especially that last part when as we're doing it, as we're reading together here, in need of constant purging. There's a real view that the monthly bleeding is a part of health, not just like it's not reduced to what we would say, which is the sign of potential fertility. It's broader than that. So the fruits that issue or don't issue from it is part of that broader understanding.
Yeah, it is so different. And women would have sort of had stuck menses for reasons other than pregnancy too, because, illness can do that. Malnutrition can do that. Right. And so in a world with more contingency where you lived closer to death and you just had stuff thrown at you, there are multiple reasons why you would not have your period and why they would connect to having your period with, I'm healthy. I have enough to eat. I'm having my period.
Right.
Right. And so there just was not this, like in our healthy day and age now, you get your period early and you have it and it's just annoying and you don't really connect it as like the fifth vital sign, which it really is for women.
And just the emphasis now on a lot of women who feel like in modern times having to bleed on a monthly basis is unacceptable, which is something, I think we can all relate to. I had a hysterectomy because I had a giant fibroid, and I can't say I miss menstruating. That would be a lie. But again, it's technology, right? And a sense of It's a paradigm that determines those expectations. And this idea that health meant to menstruate is we don't think of it that way. We just don't.
It's just like an interruption. It just gets in the way. It makes us not able to keep up with what the men are doing, right?
It is a very feminist paradigm to say, why should this be like in this day and age? Why should we have to do this? And
right. Yeah, that would have been the idea of like, oh, take this pill and then you only have 4 periods in a year. Won't that be so much better? Or none. Like women from the past would be like, are you nuts? How will you know if you're healthy if you're not menstruating?
Yeah, no, that is wow. Yeah, talk about hard to believe. And in a similar way, I think the only time that contemporary people think of a baby as a fruit is if they say Hail Mary.
You're right.
Jesus is the fruit of Mary's womb. And I love how Dudin's stories really take us back into a time when that notion wasn't a metaphor. It's not just a fancy way to say it, right? It's a real term of meaning,
right?
A real way to understand what was veiled beyond the horizon of human understanding. It's a good choice, right? As language choices go, because it focuses on the success, the outcome, but it also admits the common understanding and experience that nature can go strange. Not everything comes to fruition, right? I mean, nature must have gone strange all the time. I mean, nature, if you work with animals, in gardens, nature goes strange all the time still.
All the time.
It's told to her from the beginning, both that she will conceive and that she will bear the child. And she gets this advanced knowledge because the father is God, right? So in that way, she's the exception who proves the pre-modern rule that no woman got to know these sorts of things before they were revealed.
I never thought of it that way before. You're exactly right. That she would know that it was going to become a full, healthy baby and that there would be a birth. No woman gets to know that.
I mean, think about that and how utterly different our current experience is, right? You talked about earlier that technology has given us, and we are lulled into believing these sonogram enunciations, right? I mean, that's what a sonogram is. In a way, in a form, right? Yeah. It's this promise that you're going to bear this child. And are you? I mean, before they never would have assumed that one led to the other, right? Because they didn't have the one.
Exactly.
But right? So you try it the other way and you can't, right? I wish I could draw, because then I would just, be a cartoonist, because I often think of hilarious situations that you can just sum up with a drawing. This to me sounds like a Far Side. Maybe it's been done. You have Mary at her 3-month, sonogram, and the technician's like, it looks like a son of Rob. No, now I see it. Son of God. Something like that. Just to point out the mismatch of the paradigms, right? Because you can't have. Yes. I mean, I suppose you could wax eloquent about, a current child being the fruit of a womb, but everyone's going to think you're reaching for a flowery metaphor. But you can't do it the other way. You can't put Mary in the, at her 3-month checkup. It just doesn't work, right?
No.
And in that vein, something less funny. This caught my eye actually last summer, and I didn't tell you about it, but now I have a perfect excuse to tell you about it. So last summer, a sculpture depicting Mary giving birth was put on display at the St. Mary's Cathedral in Linz in Austria. Mary is naked from the waist down and nothing is left of the imagination. The title of the sculpture is called Crowning. So if you know anything about, birth phases, which I'm sure you do since you've done a lot of that, that's what you see.
Yes. But in a church?
The sculpture was, quote, part of an exhibition exploring women's roles in faith and tradition, end quote. And the sculptor is a woman named Esther Strauss. I'll put this article in the show notes. It's from this site called Hyperallergic. I don't know why it's called that. That's its own tangent for another day. The artist stated that she had developed the sculpture to, quote, address the gap in the birth of Christ from a feminist perspective, end quote, pointing to the sanitized descriptions of infant Jesus in the manger. Quote, most images of the Virgin Mary were made by men and have therefore often served patriarchal interests, end quote. So this is what I love about what Dudin is doing in her book. She shows us how everyone has capitulated to the modern paradigm. It is according to this paradigm that Strauss believes that not showing what birth actually looks like somehow takes away from Mary's motherhood. that all the iconic images of her holding the Christ child are engaging in a kind of conspiracy to hide something more real or more true about pregnancy. But what every mother knows, or what every mother maybe used to know before we managed pregnancy, right, and what every Hail Mary emphasizes is that what is real and true about the pregnancy is the child, the fruit.
Right.
But wait, there's more. Only a few days after being put on display, the sculpture was vandalized by being beheaded. That's rough.
Ooh.
I mean, I am not a fan of art vandals.
Yeah.
But I kind of get it.
I mean, they could have thrown a blanket over her.
Yeah, well, you're too nice an art vandal.
The sheet over the legs, little privacy screen.
But clearly it's poking too many bears. But I think it's worthwhile to consider why it's offensive to represent this mother birthing this child. Because, I mean, a statue that didn't claim to be Mary, that wasn't in a cathedral, I don't think anybody would have cared.
Exactly.
What does it tell us about the relationship between what happened, what it means, and how we represent it, both in narrative and in visual art? I think a modern way of understanding the vandalism is to say that, oh, Mary isn't just any woman. You can't show her like that. She's special. She's sacred. And I think that's certainly valid reasoning. And I think it's probably the reasoning that was going along in the head of whoever did it, right? Whoever vandalized the statue, right?
I don't think it was against Mary. I think it was or against the showing of Mary in that way.
Right. And I think that's valid reasoning. You know, in our paradigm, you know, we understand fetal development as something definite and religion as something metaphorical. So you mix something that you can't mix, which is sort of what I was saying before.
Right.
But I think what Dudin's work implies is that in pre-modern times, this gap wasn't so pronounced. In fact, it might not have even existed. You know, in Christianity, the birth of Jesus changed the world. But each pregnancy, labor, and successful bearing of fruit bore something not just natural, but also supernatural, right? Because it's one of those non-seeing things that, you know, it's the only one of the invisible things that arrives as an infant.
That's right.
So there's a supernatural element to it, right? It's coming from beyond the known, right?
It would have felt miraculous.
In this paradigm, the idea that not representing Mary in labor is patriarchal makes no sense because the significance of the shown is simply different. The privacy of the birth is but a continuation in the pre-modern paradigm of the privacy of the entire pregnancy.
Yes.
There is no further revelation about the fruit of the womb that a graphic depiction of birth can reveal.
Oh, that's exactly
There's
right.
no more there, I guess.
Yes.
Is what I'm trying to argue.
That's right. It's all already been shown. Yeah. Yeah, that sculpture, it provides a fascinating example of those different paradigms, like the horizon paradigm versus the medicalized, politicized exposure paradigm. Like the sculpture of Mary with her legs spread wide open, you know, placed inside a church as a feminist project. That's actually in the same paradigm as the fetal images deployed by the pro-life movement for their political project, right? Both are forms of exhibition. Right. And it's literally called that. It's an art exhibition, right? Holding forth something intimate for public display, as opposed to prohibition, which is holding something back as inaccessible, private, off limits, no trespassing. And to turn to Dudin's description of the tailor's wife, I find it fascinating to hear women of the past describe their bodily experiences and talk about the different kinds of fruits that issue from their womb fairly dispassionately. Like, again, they didn't draw a sharp line between what we would today call spontaneous abortion and induced abortion. They saw their monthlies in terms of purging and healthfulness. Like we said earlier, like getting your period was a sign of well-being, and stuckness could be a sign of sickness. They just didn't have the paradigm of, I'm late, I must be pregnant. And so I'm intrigued by this metaphor of the woman as a garden, producing a luxuriant abundance of fruits, some of which are, in this analogy, weeds instead of proper fruits, right? And the role of the doctor is to help nature along as it weeds the garden and grows the fruit, as both the woman and the doctor hope for the occasion of a good birth, right? For a healthy fruit of the womb for a child. But just the fact that they're not troubled by misfires or wrong growths. Like, that's just what nature does sometimes and not infrequently. Like, they don't have that developmental medical model infused with modern Christian theology that every conception is from the get-go a precious human person or soul. Like, that's just not how they experience pregnancy loss. And this is in a deeply Christian time and place. Right? Like, the tailor's wife is not a secular feminist. You know, her doctor isn't a progressive activist, like knowingly performing an abortion. Right? He's giving her something to accelerate birth.
Because it needs to come out.
it needs to come out. That's the thing. It needs to be purged, right? For her to be well. And the point is that she be well. And hopefully at some point in the future be having another child, because she's probably already got some at home, you know?
Well, and that's the only thing they can do. There's no one is under the illusion that there's anything other than going in the direction of nature is something they can do.
Yes.
Like in that way, they're on the same team.
Yes. Maybe that's part of the thing, is that that older model, they're helping nature along, and they view sort of the natural course of things as wise, rather than, I feel like our medical model is so often the battle imagery, like I'm battling cancer, like it's this war against the natural course of things, a war against aging, a war, like we're fighting it rather than participating and going along with it and accepting it. And, we're like a doula for nature, as opposed to like a knight fighting against nature.
Well, and even in the context of labor and birth and delivery, this is a real thing now, because now it's malpractice. The idea that the doctor is responsible for delivering a living child, that is a real thing. I was just reading about a huge verdict in a case where, the baby was caught behind, the head was caught behind the pelvic bone, and it just didn't go right. And the baby ended up dying because it was decapitated.
Are you kidding?
No, I'm not kidding.
Oh, that's so.
It's so
horrific.
awful. But I mean, this is
poor mother.
This is one of those things where we don't have an understanding of nature going wrong, of the body failing. We have a model where it's the living child and you killed it because you didn't get it out of me. And I mean, I'm not saying that there wasn't malpractice.
Expectations.
In this case. There may have been, but it's those expectations are now different. And I'm not saying that it wouldn't have been awful 250 years ago. I mean, 250 years ago, the mother probably would have died. Although I don't actually know. Right. I mean, I think they did have techniques for, I think they understood the risks of, the baby's life versus the mother's life. I don't think people were idiots. I mean, if they're doing a lot of births, they would have known all these things. But just the idea of the not knowing about the development of the fetus also holds up until the result of the delivery, right? Because you don't know if you remember, I've said this on the podcast before, but the word to deliver was never referred to the baby originally. I think Illich says this. Right. Illich does say this, because where else would I have gotten this, right? Yeah. He says it was the mother who was delivered, as in like delivered, like the Jews were delivered out of Egypt in the Exodus. Like, and the stakes are kind of that high. I mean, can you imagine without any, quote unquote modern, I mean, they must have had painkillers. They had stuff. They did things, I'm sure, that we don't know. Yeah. It's a harrowing experience.
Harrowing. That's a great way to say it.
The woman who was delivered of the child. It was about her surviving, because again,
surviving the crisis
pregnant all the time. If you're, it really all comes down to the continuity of the woman as a garden, right? And there isn't this expectation that every fruit has to be a success. Like this notion of, we just have a completely, utterly different notion of what failure means, and it sounds like callous to talk about this way. It was just a different paradigm.
Right. And I feel like, when I think of someone like Louise Perry or Mary Harrington, particularly Louise Perry, when she talks about abortion, she had that particular article in First Things where she was connecting abortion with repaganizing. Like, I feel like when people think about women's attitudes towards the fruits of the womb in the past, they're inclined to think of anything connected with abortion as pagan. But but Christians are so different. We are repaganizing, I think was the name of the article. And so what was interesting to me about reading this stuff from Duden about, clearly, like, this is in Germany in the 1700s. Like, this is a Christian culture. This is a Christian era. This is not paganism of like the 300s or something, right? This is Christian. So Christian folks in a Christian city coping with the uncertainties of nature, trying to get the woman healthfully back on track, right? And every woman of that time would have known the herbal abortifacient recipes and would have probably made use of them at some point, whether or not they kind of consciously realized, like, they had the framework of purging and healthfulness. So they were not thinking, oh, I'm pregnant, I'm going to abort this baby. I mean, like, maybe, but a lot of the time, probably not. But they would have been triggering them. They would have been purging early pregnancies, not uncommonly. Like an example of this is in one of Ben Franklin's books. He wrote those almanacs, like everyday useful knowledge the average person should know, and it included a list of popular at-home abortifacient recipes, and that was just in there amongst the other things everybody should know. And it was unremarkable. It was uncontroversial at the time for that to be included, because that was just part of life. That was part of being a married woman, is how you managed things.
Wow.
And so learning this about American and European history, which obviously heavily overlaps with Christian history, has definitely complicated like the straightforward medicalized and sentimentalized pro-life narrative that I grew up with. Like our modern pro-life and pro-choice categories do not map neatly onto the past. Our technologies created new categories and redrew moral boundary lines. And this is crucial to recognize. The technology didn't reveal long-standing real categories we were somehow blind to. Rather, it created new categories. It created the phenomenon of the fetus, which forced us to begin a kind of moral innovation in response. It's anachronistic to take today's pro-life movement, which is so ultrasound saturated, and located as is, unchanged in past centuries. And certainly that, the early church, they did talk about, they were against abortion and contraception. They were against women taking potions, yes, that you can find that. But so often it was framed, again, it was just framed very differently. It was like, well, you shouldn't be doing these things because there was some adulterous relationship and you're trying to cover up from it. So it's actually really connected with sexual sin, or, or it's like, oh, that's an offense against marriage, because marriage is meant for producing lots of children and that's what it's for. And so how could you be having sexual pleasure that's not resulting in a child? It's like so connected with sexual sin in a way that we don't frame things in the same way these days. So it's just not a straight line. The moral reasoning for the prohibition is so different that you just can't put an equal sign between them and be like, these are exactly the same thing, or it's exactly the same movement. There's a thread connecting them, but they are not the same. And so I'm just sort of realizing sort of the falseness of saying, oh, abortion, that's just totally a pagan thing. And then Christians never do that. It's like, that's not actually how things went.
Well, and the term pagan, like, it seems to be tossed around as a word for, liberal, secular liberal avant la lettre, which it also wasn't. I mean, like, pagan meant like believing in lots of different gods. I mean, It was if you went back and like looked at what pagans did, it would look like religion to you, because it was. It just wasn't Judeo-Christian religion.
Right.
So like to use pagan as a way to say like unfeeling secular atheists, it's just like, that's sloppy.
Yeah.
All right. Well, speaking of understanding this in a specifically Christian context, this was one of the most surprising parts of the book for me. The redefinition of life, the sort of, the noun in the context of Christianity. Duden goes on a real tear about this because she makes it very obvious that if you take these early images and you try to use the sort of narratives about, image and likeness of God, you're going to get yourself in some weird places. Here is a quote from that section. All Christian denominations place great importance on baptism. In the major churches, infant baptism has become the rule, and in the Roman Catholic Church, there is a well-established tradition imposing on everyone the duty to baptize a newly born infant in danger of death. From the end of World War II well into the 1960s, the Church's new concern with the fetus was reflected in a novel set of instructions. These ruled that every Catholic nurse should sprinkle water on anything she suspected might be a spontaneous abortion. While doing this, she was to pronounce the conditional formula of baptism, saying, "If you are human, I baptize you." Okay? And then she goes on to stress that this idea of pastoral care for the non-living and the unborn is actually utterly novel, is what she says. In most of the New Testament and in 2,000 years of ecclesiastical usage, to have life means to participate as a believing Christian in the life of Christ, a mode of living which is placed in stark contrast to mere human existence. Even the dead live in Christ, and only those who live in Christ have life in this world. Of those who exist outside this relationship, the Church has consistently spoken of those who live under conditions of death. In this sense, and only in this sense, is life holy, and can one speak of the sacredness of life. This is simply the traditional understanding and teaching.
Wow.
I think that was the most surprising part of the book for me.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And it's very Illich, the way they're willing to go for the jugular.
Yes.
You know,
so Illich.
in terms of, Catholicism, right?
Yep.
So by sheer coincidence, we've happened upon 2 Catholic baptisms during our stay here in Europe. One while we were still in Karlsruhe in Germany, and one here in St. Johann in Tyrol in Austria. I'm literally living in a town named after a saint. Awesome. It's like being in California, San Jose. When you attend this ceremony, it's abundantly clear that it is not celebrating the mere physical existence of the child, but rather that child's entry into the life of the church, meaning, of course, the life of Christ. The sacrament of baptism, which dissolves original sin, marks the beginning of this life, and the child is also given godparents as additional shepherds on this spiritual way. Baptism is the first sacrament given to all cradle or converted Catholics, if not previously baptized. It is a sacrament that points to the future, like a new beginning, right? It is a sacrament for the living. And of course, that's not to say that everyone who lives doesn't eventually die. They do. But the idea is it's the beginning of a new life.
Yes.
For the church to have succumbed to the revelations of photoscopy is kind of disappointing in that light, right? But perhaps understandable. I mean, everyone's in it, right? The paradigm. It doesn't matter whether you're pro-life, pro-choice, conservative, secular, liberal, Christian. It doesn't matter. We're all in it. But I think Duden is really persuasive here when she argues that the church is adopting an expressly modern notion, that this abstract notion of life, this bio-life essence, we might call it, is hiding in things that our common sense tells us are not alive. If baptism is a sacrament for the living, as judged by common sense, then it is not just unnecessary to baptize a spontaneous abortion, but actually nonsensical. It is one of those other kinds of fruits, as we were just talking about, right? Yeah. And baptism is a sacrament specific to the child fruit, or the once was child fruit adult.
Yes. And you know that this is the case too, because the Christian concept of baptism is a beautiful sort of elaboration of riff off of circumcision from the Old Testament, which was, am I right? They were circumcised at 8 days after birth. That's when sort of the sign was applied. So it's not even birth, it's 8 days after birth, which is interesting. But it's it's marking a beginning. It just makes me realize, I wonder if there will ever be some development of, let's get some holy water up there inside the womb to baptize them while they're still.
Don't give them ideas.
I don't know. But that would be fitting with the paradigm that they have, right? That you would baptize as soon as you squirt a little baptism water inside the uterus or something, or that would fit with what this medicalized paradigm is saying. If you're going to take the sacrament in the direction of what you say you believe, that's what you would do. Why baptize at birth? Why not baptize before birth? Because if all these things apply, if birth really doesn't make any real difference.
Well, now you sound like a Mormon who baptizes the dead. That's also a way to extend it, right?
Yeah, that's right. Interesting. Well, sorry to interrupt you there. Keep going. But I love that line that baptism is a sacrament specific to the child fruit.
It's probably unlikely that the church is going to step back from this modern pregnancy paradigm, even if I think the theological basis is there to do it.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
But you understand why. I mean, the church may be a very old institution, but it's not immune to the culture in which it persists. I mean, it's one of those things. I feel like it's after evolution. They just couldn't take another hit. It's a lack of confidence. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It would have been very difficult to say, this is what you know, but this is what we know.
Right.
Even though the Gospels say it.
Yeah.
But those things are hard, right? I mean,
yeah.
It hasn't been the best 150 years for transcendent thinking and horizon-based models,
Yes.
What I find really interesting about it is the common political line on this is to think that the church is conservative on the issue, meaning traditional. But Duden shows that actually the church has, just like the rest of us, entirely modern ideas about conception and pregnancy. They just swallowed it whole. You know, they just took all the modern stuff and said, yep. And now we're just going to extend what we think about, you know, the fruit to the not fruit. And they didn't even know, like,
they didn't even know
they were doing it. And I think it's come at some cost, right? I mean, I think it's contributed to the casual demonization of women who have abortions as murderers, because it simplifies it, right? I mean, it's like, you know, obviously killing a child, infanticide, is a murder. And so if it's life all the way back, then any intervention before is also murder.
Murder all the way back.
Exactly.
Yep.
And it's had especially terrible political consequences, ones that I obviously exceed any affiliation with Catholicism. But like this abortion as murder conviction seems to be uniquely galvanizing, right?
Yeah.
Given that we're unfortunately kind of declining into a new period in America of political violence, I was really surprised to discover that it appears, from what we know now, that the Minnesota shooter who, you know, he killed 2 people and he seriously wounded 2 others because he was targeting 2 Democratic lawmakers in Minnesota, and he killed one of them and her spouse, and then severely injured the other 2. Like he was motivated by the lawmakers' support for legal abortion. So it's a unique horror, right? Politically, this unique horror that is so bent, right? Because it's like, why are you killing if you're pro-life, right? Why are you murdering people to like, you know, abortion-related terrorism is a very old story since the rise of the modern pro-life movement. And but it wouldn't be possible without this modern pregnancy paradigm. It wouldn't have happened.
Right. Yeah. The modern pregnancy paradigm of medical voyeurism creates the embryo and the fetus as these independent specters needing human rights, and thus needing bold defenders of those rights at any cost. Right. So in his mind, this man is like a hero fighting in a war to save babies from a modern Holocaust. Right. He's in that narrative. And I think that the pro-choice messaging that insists on women's self-determination at all costs, at every stage of pregnancy, you know, to the extreme, like shout your abortion destigmatization campaigns, that's an attempt to fight back, but within the medical paradigm, right? Because abortion is healthcare, right? That's the phrase. And within the framework of women's civil rights to bodily autonomy. But this culture war clash of women's rights versus fetal rights is downstream from the images. It's downstream from the showcase. Right. And what you and I find most interesting and helpful is learning all we can from that pre-showcase, pre-medicalized paradigm. Again, like notice the parallel with trans rights, which only became a thing once we had certain, you know, technological innovations, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, genital surgeries, you know, that basically created this new class of person, you know, beyond simply male or female human being, a new class of person deserving of civil rights, right? The technology creates the idea of this new class of person in the mind of a culture, you know, when it simply didn't exist before. So Caitlyn Jenner on the cover of Vanity Fair is of a piece with that floating astronaut image of the fetus on the cover of Life.
Now that is amazing.
That is the same thing happening. They are both the shown, right? The medical technology dependent shown that we are now supposed to get behind, feel about this new type of person that needs the civil rights. And if I had to imagine the next magazine cover of a visualize on command shown image that's meant to elicit those certain emotions that move us to grant civil rights to a new class of person, I know who's next. It'll be the image of the humanoid AI. The AI is next. Right. And it's the extension of the personhood and the civil rights movement, groping and searching for who's next that we can protect and expand and find. And it will happen through the shown. Right. We will be shown what we are supposed to support. And it's all about asking us to mistrust our eyes, and it's going to screw with our senses. You know, we're supposed to believe what we are shown. So that quote from Duden about baptism and traditional Christian theology on life contrasted with kind of the bio-life essence, like what you said, that's so Illichian. And it reminds me of this moment in the 1980s when Ivan Illich was asked by the minister Will Campbell, who was this major figure in the civil rights movement. He supported Martin Luther King. Campbell asked Illich to come and speak to a gathering of Christian ministers about the subject of, quote unquote, life. And so here's a quote from David Cayley's biography of Illich that describes this moment. And I love it because it's so classic Illich. I wish I could have been there. So here's from the book. It says, Campbell told Illich that he feared that the question of life was, quote, tearing our churches apart. On issues like nuclear disarmament, abortion, capital punishment, and ecology, he said that Christians were at each other's throats. He then asked his great favor. If he assembled a meeting of church leaders, would Illich come and address them on the subject of life? Illich was immediately apprehensive, but bound by his promise to obey. He agreed. The meeting took place within the year in Ohio. The atmosphere was tense. A representative of the Catholic Bishops' Conference who was present urged Illich to begin with a mollifying prayer. Illich instead began with a solemn curse. Raising his hands, he repeated 3 times, "To hell with life! To hell with life! To hell with life!" This dramatic ceremony began Illich's engagement with what he would later call the most powerful idol the church has had to face in the course of her history. It was not an issue on which he was ever able to make himself widely understood. He's like such an Old Testament prophet figure. I love it. He's like rebuking and cursing like in front of all the ministers. I just love it.
You think he was able to make himself well understood? Gee, I wonder why.
So Illich was adamant that the historical Christian teaching on life is that, to have life is to, as Duden says, participate as a believing Christian in the life of Christ, a mode of living which is placed in stark contrast to mere human existence. Right, so life means life in God, communion with God, and death means separation from God affected through sin and evil. So the true death isn't when a physical heart stops beating. It's when the spiritual heart says F you to God. That's death. And so Illich views the sacralizing of bio-life, like protecting at all costs the beating heart and extending its beating as long as is technologically possible, to be a form of idolatry and not a form of love. Like it's taking the abundant life that Christ talks about in the Gospels and concretizing it, literalizing it into the brainwave and the heartbeat. And it makes gospel life imminent instead of eternal and mystical. So here's Christ as quoted in Matthew 16:25. "For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." And those words make no sense at all if life only means bio-life. Like Christ, who dies that we might have eternal life, is expressly demoting the value of bio-life in these words. He's making sure that the beating heart doesn't sit on the throne. Right? Bio-life is relativized and situated as valuable, but not a supreme value. He's saying you've got to be willing to let it go. And in the book of John, Jesus says the following: "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die." So here he's saying that he himself is life with a capital L. And because that's true, you can physically die and yet have life. So this gospel understanding of life makes sense in the pre-modern, pre-medical paradigm, but it's an affront. It's offensive to the pro-life medical paradigm, which can take the shape of extreme anti-abortion bans, or extending the life of elderly people or severely premature babies through drastic measures and invasive machines. Or it can look like Brian Johnson, like that multimillionaire tech bro who's trying to physically live forever and spends all of his time all day, like taking vitamins and injecting himself with his son's blood and plasma and trying to do all these weird things to live forever. That kind of pro-life is not gospel life. It's idolatry.
So I think this is a good moment to riff on maybe some of the news coming out of the UK about the law changes. Mary Harrington wrote a piece today sort of connecting the passage of, assisted dying and the decriminalization of self-induced abortion. There was a very well-known case during COVID about a woman who ordered abortion pills and basically lied about where she was in her pregnancy and basically did a late-term abortion on herself chemically.
It's pretty dangerous.
Yes. And was prosecuted because it's against the law, or it was. And so there was a lot of sympathy because punishing her doesn't really gain anything. But at the same time, there's a difference, I think. I think everybody recognizes the difference. There's a point where, even like in the old times, there's a stage where it comes from trying to, unstick your menses to, hope for the child. There's a transition
Exactly,
there.
Right.
It does occur.
There is. Yep.
And it's very easy to frame the opposition here as the sort of, it's the secular biolibertarians who are arguing for these laws and these sort of, traditional Christians who are on the restraining end. But I think this idea that the worship of life is idolatrous is a really important challenge to that.
Yes.
And it challenges it by basically saying, there are natural limits to life.
Yeah.
They go together. Why is there this paranoia about the end of life? Well, maybe it's because we have so many means to artificially extend it, that dying becomes this almost unreachable, endpoint.
Yeah, people do live so much longer than they used to. And there's so many ways to get a few more weeks, get a few more months, get a few more years, that there feels like an obligation to keep going and going and going.
And you worry about, like, who's going to care for you? I feel like it's a reaction to the fact that people can't count on other people to care for them.
Yes. Right, because you don't want to live indefinitely if you're old and struggling when there's no one, if you think my children can't take care of me. Or you'll have older people who will want to commit suicide because they expressly don't want to be a burden to their families. And I feel like that sort of whole question, which is so sad, and it comes up in part because we have so many ways to destroy the cancer that 10 years prior would have killed that person. You know what I mean? So they wouldn't have been a burden to their family because they would have sort of, quote unquote, naturally died much earlier because of other things. And so we create our sort of extension of life and ability to solve problems medically has created all of these new relational problems and financial problems, which downstream ends up leading to this question of assisted suicide. I'm not saying that I support it. I just I see it as a self-generated problem.
Yeah, medical assistance in dying wouldn't be needed if we didn't have so much medical assistance in living.
Exactly.
It came from that.
Exactly. Yes. Right. You're absolutely right.
And we don't know how to suffer. Like, we don't know how to help
Right.
each other. We don't know how to suffer individually. We don't know how to suffer together. Because, I mean, obviously, how are you going to make space in society to learn how to suffer when, like you were saying, it's all that imagery is like going to war against the disease?
That's right. It's always a battle. And how are you anything other than a coward to not fight? Right? Like when battle is the terminology, it's like, well, you can't just give up before it's begun. What's wrong with you? Why aren't you going to fight? You need the right analogies to be able to make the right kind of wise moral choices. And if the only language and the only analogies you're given for anything negative medically is fight, is war, anything else other than that is going to be seen in a negative light. So we've cut off options from ourselves because we don't have the right analogies.
The debate isn't between do we value life or do we not? Like,
right.
That simplifies the debate. Like, I don't agree with assisted suicide either, but I understand where the fear comes from. I understand that the paradigm we're working in, makes that seem like a good option.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's pick on the liberals some more here. This last section, equal opportunity abstraction. So this is getting back to what we alluded to at the very beginning of the episode about the sort of parallel to, abstract life being epitomized by the zygote. Here we have the opposite, which is the image of the whole world as one ecology and life as something that just lives on Earth, right? Non-specific. Duden writes, while the whale, the rainforest, the terminal Alzheimer's patient, the spina bifida infant, the botched suicide, and those affected by Kaposi's sarcoma constantly emerge from a mixed bag of threatened lives, life itself finds its principal visual expression in two complementary discs. On the one hand, the blue planet, on the other, the transparent pink zygote. This pair has moved to the top of the list of cult objects in the 1990s. Any criticism of how the word life is used, she means, is immediately answered by someone who connects life with right or value or sacredness, and by doing so evokes 6 million Jews, or 60 million fetuses, or large numbers of Kurds and Cambodians, or even the rainforests, bugs, and grasses. The four-letter word is meaningless and loaded. It can barely be analyzed, yet it is a declaration of war. It is so true that the fetuses and the dead Jews in the Holocaust and the 60 million fetuses, that is like, I swear, have I already said on this podcast that if I had $1 for every time like that was uttered, I could retire? Maybe I just told you that, but
you have told me that.
It epitomizes that sort of, holier than thou. I know exactly what my values are. I'm more moral. I think I must have sent this to you, this idea that if you had a warehouse full of the zygotes of descendants of all the Jews killed in the Holocaust, that you wouldn't have actually solved the problem of what was lost in the Holocaust, because it's not about biological life. Right. It's about the culture that no longer exists. Yeah, we talked about this in the last episode because we were talking about people love dead Jews. Mm-hmm. So it's so easy though, right? We want to go there. And you came up with the perfect expression for this, reductive conflict, like life discs at war. Mm-hmm. And we know now, like Duden makes us realize that this is a political divide where everyone has agreed on a shared paradigm that redefines what life means. It's just this like, it doesn't matter if you've never taken a breath. It's this simultaneous reductiveness, whether it's the dead Jews that were killed, like it reducing them to the fact of their murder, which is not, I think obviously murder's bad. Murder at scale is also bad, but it's comparing that to abortion is basically saying it doesn't matter what they did or thought or spoke or made when they were alive. It's just the murder. It's just the killing. It's just the bioessence that matters.
And then it becomes a statistic.
Right. And then you can say that like, we're having a Holocaust every, whatever, because you can make a substitution there that reduces, a murdered Jew or any other suffering person to, the zygote.
Right. I think the best way to diffuse the war of the life discs of blue planet versus pink zygote is to be pronatal. It means being pro-family, which means being pro-marriage. Like it's regaining the narrative. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes the baby in the baby carriage, right? Instead of staking everything on the abstraction of life as the idol of bio-life, either on its largest scale, ecologically, planetarily, or the smallest scale, embryonically. What this means is that we're attempting to rekindle hope, right? Like taking the plunge to get married and starting a family these days is definitely an act of hope. And I think that matters much more in the long run, socially, politically, spiritually, than trying to get laws passed on abortion or climate change. The abstractions, it just doesn't matter nearly as much as the personal stake of having hope and making a life choice that will be fruitful, that will be a fruitful communion. At the end of her book, Duden talks about, the difference between the older descriptive language of aliveness and the modern substantive abstraction we call life or a life. And she writes this, I just love this section. The word nature is derived from nasitura, which means birthing. And nature is imagined and felt to be like a pregnant womb, a matrix, a mother. In its aliveness, nature brings forth both lifeless and living beings. Woman's pregnancy is the eminent analogy to nature's constant action. Nature's aliveness and pregnancy are rooted in the continual creative activity of God. The world becomes a gift. Nature engenders, insofar as it is sustained and elevated by the hand of God. The aliveness of nature is experienced as the result of its closeness to the Creator. Isn't that beautiful?
It really is.
I love that. Our bio life is utterly contingent on God's creativity and generosity. So aliveness is closeness to Him, dependence on Him. Right? It's recognizing that contingency. So that's the pre-modern, pre-medical paradigm. And Duden says that the struggle of modernity to disentangle nature from its contingency and to, quote, sever its aliveness from the life of God is what has led us to the sorry state that we're in now, like with the loss of horizon, the loss of hope, the loss of faith, the loss of communion. And it's what has led to the desperate war for control of the planet, of women's wombs, and to our terror of physical death and suffering. So I echo Illich here, to hell with life. And I raise my glass to aliveness, to contingency, and to closeness with God. And I raise my glass to the world as a gift and not as a possession or as a right. So, viva la nasitura.
Well said. Yeah, I mean, we've definitely got a ways to go. I think, how are we going to put this all into practice?
I don't know.
One little book club at a time, hopefully.
I guess so. Yeah, in that sense, the most practical thing, I think, is reading things that unsettle your certainties, right? And talking with other people, and moving towards that really good, fruitful, pronatal narrative of marriage and family formation. It's how the world moves forward. It's how culture is transmitted. And it's not an abstraction of a life, like go out and have a life or create a life. It's, be part of a family and help encourage the growth of families. That's concrete and particular rather than an abstraction or a statistic. I know I can get very caught up in listening to all the latest podcasts about, the birth rates are plummeting and, disaster is on the horizon, with all of that. But I don't know. I'm just trying to raise my kids.
Well, I think that's a good unit of focus. And we'll be talking about McGilchrist next.
Excellent. All right. Well, goodbye for now.
Do your homework.